The wind that swept over the walls of Constantinople that night was heavy with the smell of the sea, brine mingling with the faint, metallic scent of iron and blood. Beneath the stars, the ancient stones of the Theodosian walls seemed to groan, and their mortar, as if they'd understood that they had stood for over 1,000 years only to face their final trial in the hours to come. Torches guttered along the battlements, their flames bending in the wind, casting long, jittering shadows that danced across the weary faces of men who knew they were watching history end. Below them, the vast Ottoman camp stretched beyond the horizon, a forest of pikes and banners, their scarlet cloth fluttering against the dark, each marking the presence of soldiers who had come from every corner of an empire that was young, hungry, and merciless. In the city, bells tolled from Hagia Sophia, their solemn chimes rippling through narrow streets were the last remnants of Byzantium's. Citizens prayed, wept, and clung to the fragments of a world that was about to vanish. Emperor Constantine XI Paleologos stood in the candlelit gloom of his private chamber. His armor lay before him like a silent companion awaiting the dawn, his thoughts drifting not to victory, but to the unbroken line of emperors before him whose legacy he now bore alone. He had fought as both ruler and soldier, but tonight, under the weight of inevitability, he felt less like a sovereign and more like a caretaker of a corpse, an empire already dead in all but name. This is Candle and Coffin. Let's uncover the forgotten truth beneath the ashes of history. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this story travels. Outside the palace, the city's great bronze gates loomed shut, their rivets blackened from centuries of wear, their hinges groaning in the wind, while beyond them, the Sultan's cannons massive, unblinking beasts of bronze waited for the first light, their gaping maws hungry for the stones of Constantinople. That night, the moon hung low, a thin, pale sickle in the sky, its light sliding over rooftops and domes, over markets now empty, over fountains that had run dry, over the mosaics whose saints seemed to watch in sorrow. And yet, in the heart of the city, there was still a strange, brittle kind of hope, not the hope of triumph, but the hope that even in defeat, something eternal might endure, the faith, the memory, the stubborn defiance of a people who had outlasted emperors, plagues, crusades, and centuries of war. But as the hours bled toward dawn, the drums in the Ottoman camp began to beat, slow and steady, like the footsteps of fate itself. And every sound seemed to whisper the same truth: the empire that could not be saved was about to face its last sunrise. The empire had been dying long before the cannons of Mehmed thundered at its walls. Its veins had been opened not by a single sword stroke, but by 1,000 tiny cuts, inflicted over centuries by enemies, allies, and its own hand. Once, Byzantium had been the jewel of the Mediterranean, the great eastern half of Rome, a city of silk and gold where traders from Africa, Asia, and Europe spilled into the same markets beneath the gilded dome of Hagia Sophia. And emperors ruled from thrones that gleamed like captured sunlight. But empires rot from within before they are broken from without. And for Byzantium, the decay had begun generations earlier, its borders shrinking like water evaporating under a relentless sun. Its armies thin, its treasury bled by endless wars against Bulgars, Normans, Seljuks, and the Latin West. The Fourth Crusade had been the knife in the gut when Christian knights, sworn to liberate the Holy Land, instead sacked the Queen of Cities in 1204, ripping her wealth into 1,000 pieces and scattering them to Venice, Paris, and Rome. Though the Byzantines reclaimed Constantinople in 1261, they returned to a shadow of their former glory. Walls cracked, palaces burned, the imperial navy rotting in its harbors, power fractured, with noble houses scheming against one another, each more interested in protecting its own dwindling estates than in the survival of the state. As the Ottomans rose to power in Anatolia, swallowing city after city, Byzantium's emperors grew desperate, sometimes bending the knee to the Sultan for survival, other times clinging to the West, seeking aid from kingdoms that remembered only the gold they had plundered to centuries earlier. And yet, every plea came with a price. Rome demanded union with the Orthodox Church, a bitter pill that split the empire's own people, with priests and citizens railing against what they saw as betrayal of their faith. By the time Constantine XI took the throne, the empire had been reduced to little more than the city itself, with a few scattered territories clinging to the Peloponnese like flotsam in a storm. The Ottomans, under Mehmed II Young, brilliant and ruthless, saw what the world already knew. The last fragment of Rome was vulnerable, isolated, and ripe for the taking. And so, the empire stumbled toward its fate, not in a sudden fall, but in a long, slow collapse. Each year, each betrayal, each mischance bringing it closer to that inevitable May morning when the Sultan's shadow would finally swallow the queen of cities holed out by the winter of 1452. The noose had already begun to tighten, though many within Constantinople still clung to the illusion that the city's walls, those towering, triple-layered Theodosian fortifications that had turned back countless sieges, were an unbreakable shield. But beyond the horizon, Mehmed was forging a weapon that would change the very nature of war. Massive bombards cast from bronze so thick they could hurl stones the size of oxen against those ancient walls until they cracked and crumbled like clay. One of these monstrous guns, built by the Hungarian engineer Orban after being rejected by Constantine for lack of funds, now belonged to the Sultan, a betrayal of technology as much as of loyalty. Mehmed had not come merely to conquer, he had come to erase, to claim for himself the seat of Caesar and the dream of a world united under his crescent banner. Throughout the empire's long decline, there had been whispers that the walls of Constantinople were guarded not only by stone and steel, but by divine promise, that the Virgin herself watched over the city. Yet now, as news spread of the Sultan's new fortress, Rumeli Hisari, rising on the Bosphorus to choke the Black Sea and cut off aid, faith began to tremble. Inside the city, Constantine XI worked tirelessly, a soldier emperor walking the ramparts, speaking with the Genos captain Giovanni Giustiniani, whose contingent of seasoned soldiers had come to defend the walls, their skill a slender thread between survival and annihilation. Yet, for every defender, there were streets filled with the poor, the old, the frightened souls who could not wield a sword, but whose prayers rose like smoke toward a sky that remained silent. Winter storms raked the Sea of Marmara, but in the Ottoman camp across the strait, the fires never dimmed, and the Sultan's ships, sleek and black, prowled the waters like wolves. Merchants still spoke in hushed tones of the day when the Dardanelles had fallen under Turkish control, when the empire's lifeline to the Aegean was severed, and with it the hope of a fleet riding to their rescue. In the taverns and shadowed corners of Constantinople, there were those who muttered that perhaps the city should yield. That life under the Sultan might be preferable to death under the rubble. But to Constantine, and to those who still carried the unyielding pride of Rome, surrender was not survival, it was the end of all that they were, the extinguishing of 1,000 years of empire. And so, while the city's ancient streets echoed with church bells and the smell of burning oil, far beyond its gates, the young Sultan sharpened his plans. The empire's enemies closed in, and the great wheel of history creaked toward its final turn. Spring came early in 1453, and with it came the shadow of an army unlike any the Byzantines had faced in living memory. Across the plains beyond the Theodosian walls, the banners of the Ottoman host unfurled like a tide of blood and shadow, their colors snapping in the wind, their crescents glinting in the sunlight. They came in countless ranks, janissaries in their tall white headgear, disciplined as blades, Sipahi cavalry astride war horses clad in steel barding, irregular Akin raiders with eyes as sharp as the knives at their belts, and behind them, the endless train of camp followers, artillery crews, and slaves dragging the siege guns into place. To the watchers on the walls, it seemed as though all the lands of Islam had emptied themselves into the plain before Constantinople. And at the heart of it all, beneath a canopy embroidered with gold, sat Mehmed, just 21 years old, but with the gaze of a man who had already written himself into history. He rode a black stallion that pawed at the earth, its armor gleaming, his own robes of crimson and white flowing around him like a banner of war. In the city, Justiniani's Genoese engineers and Byzantine masons worked feverishly, repairing cracks, reinforcing gates, and stockpiling stones and arrows for the fight to come. Women and children carried baskets of earth to fill breaches. In the inner walls, while priests carried icons along the ramparts, blessing the defenders, Constantine XI moved among his people with the gravity of a man who knew each word he spoke might be his last. His presence both a reassurance and a reminder of the stakes. Yet beneath the veneer of unity, tension smoldered. Orthodox citizens, who despised the recent union with Rome, muttered against the Latin defenders, while some among the Venetians and Genoese quietly calculated how they might profit from the city's fall. The Golden Horn's great chain was raised, sealing the harbor, and the Byzantine navy, little more than a handful of ships, took its positions, alongside allied vessels from Venice and Genoa. Across the water, Ottoman galleys patrolled, sleek and patient, like predators waiting for a moment to strike. The air grew heavy with the smell of pitch and the sound of hammers striking iron, and each sunrise brought the enemy's siege lines closer to the walls. In the taverns, markets, and churches, whispers spread that the city had entered its final Lent, and that this year, Easter might dawn on ruins. Yet, still, there was no surrender. Constantinople would face its fate as it had faced all storms before, with walls unbroken, with faith unyielding, and with the eyes of the world upon it. On April 6, 1453, the siege began in earnest, and the ground itself seemed to shudder under the first roar of the great Ottoman bombards. The largest of them, Urban's monstrous bronze cannon, spat forth a boulder that soared through the air, like a wrathful planet crashing against the outer wall. In an explosion of dust and shattered stone, the defenders braced, plugging the wounds in the masonry with earth and rubble. But each shot carried the weight of inevitability, each impact a reminder that these walls, which had withstood centuries of assaults, were no longer invincible. The Ottoman lines crept closer each day, trenches and earthworks sprouting like veins across the plain, their soldiers working under cover of night to position more guns, more ladders, more siege towers. At the same time, the Sultan ordered an audacious maneuver that stunned the city with ropes, rollers, and the strength of hundreds of men and oxen. He hauled dozens of war galleys overland on greased timbers, bypassing the great chain that sealed the Golden Horn and setting them down inside the sheltered harbor. One morning, the citizens awoke to see Ottoman sails where there had been only Byzantine waters, and panic rippled through the streets like fire through dry grass. Justiniani scrambled to reinforce the sea walls. His men stretched them between two fronts, while Constantine convened councils in the palace, his voice steady even as the situation grew dire. Priests led processions through the city, carrying relics and chanting prayers for divine intervention. But above the sacred hymns, the steady thunder of the Sultan's guns spoke of a different reality. The age of miracles was over, and the age of powder and steel had begun. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed moved like a conductor among his troops, directing the tempo of the siege with cold precision. He knew that fear was as potent a weapon as any blade, and each day, he tightened the pressure, launching feigned assaults to exhaust the defenders, battering the walls until every man on them was bone-tired and deafened by the roar. The markets of the city grew quieter, the bread thinner, the faces gaunter, yet still the gates remained shut, and the banners of Byzantium fluttered defiantly in the spring breeze. The city, like a proud old lion, stood wounded but unbroken, while beyond its walls, the young Sultan sharpened his claws for the kill. By late April, the siege had become a relentless ritual of destruction and repair, a deadly rhythm that ground on without pause. At dawn, the great cannons thundered, hurling stones that split the air with a deep, bone-vibrating hum before smashing into the walls. By day, teams of defenders swarmed over the breaches, shoveling earth, hauling timbers, and stacking rubble in desperate attempts to restore what had been lost. By night, the Ottomans crept forward under the cover of darkness, filling the cities, moat with fascines and rubble, preparing the ground for an all-out assault. The air reeked of smoke, sweat, and the acrid tang of spent powder, and the once-proud fields before the walls had become a wasteland churned into mud and corpses. Inside Constantinople, life narrowed into a series of siege routines, water rationing, bread lines, the constant tolling of bells to signal danger. Every rooftop became a watchpost. Every able hand, regardless of age or gender, was drawn into the defense. Women carried buckets of boiling oil to the ramparts. Boys scurried through the alleys with bundles of arrows, and priests anointed soldiers before they took their posts, offering blessings that could not stop the cannonballs but might stiffen the will to stand. The political cracks inside the city deepened as suspicion grew between the Orthodox Greeks and their Latin allies, with some whispering that betrayal from within would strike before the Ottomans breached the gates. Constantine XI, unwilling to let distrust fracture the last defense, held council after council, pressing unity as if words alone could hold the walls together. Beyond the city, Mehmed II adjusted his siege lines with the patience of a predator, moving his artillery to exploit new weaknesses, ordering constant skirmishes to drain the defenders' strength, and directing his navy to tighten the blockade, until the city was strangled of hope still. The people clung to the belief that perhaps relief would come. A Venetian fleet, a miracle of the sea, a sign that the Queen of Cities was not entirely forsaken. But each day the horizon remained empty, the waters beyond the Bosphorus unbroken by friendly sails. And in the gathering silence between bombardments, the citizens began to hear the truth that none dared speak aloud. They were alone. The tension inside the city reached a fever pitch as May dawned, and the knowledge that the final assault was imminent settled like a shroud over Constantinople's ancient stones. The defenders, numbering barely a few thousand Byzantines, Genoese, Venetians, and a handful of mercenaries, stood shoulder to shoulder along the battered walls, their faces etched with exhaustion, fear, and stubborn defiance. Emperor Constantine XI moved among them, a figure both inspiring and tragic, his presence a beacon in the gathering darkness. Every man, woman, and child in the city understood that their fate was intertwined with this battle, not just a fight for land, but a struggle for identity, faith, and the last flicker of a fading empire. The city's churches overflowed with worshippers, their prayers rising in desperate chorus, seeking mercy or a miracle that history seemed unwilling to grant. Meanwhile, the Ottoman camp was a hive of restless energy. Mehmed II paced beneath, his banners, eyes fixed on the city that had eluded conquest for over a millennium. The Sultan's confidence was tempered by respect for the walls and their defenders. Yet he knew that his cannons and relentless pressure had prepared the ground for the final blow. Scouts reported movement within the walls, the last reinforcements, arriving, some fresh, but many aged and weary, their spirits as battered as the stones beneath their feet on the eve of the assault. A stillness fell, broken only by whispered prayers and the soft clinking of armor being donned. Constantine took one last moment in the dim light of his chamber, staring out over the city he would soon lose, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was both the last emperor of Byzantium and the first martyr of its fall. As dawn crept over the horizon, the drums of war began their mournful beat, echoing off the stones, signaling that the empire that could not be saved was poised on the knife edge of history, waiting for the final storm to break. The first light of May 29th, 1453, spilled cold and gray across the battered walls of Constantinople, revealing an empire braced for its last stand. The city, cloaked in centuries of glory and dust, held its breath as Mehmed II unleashed the full fury of his army. The thunder of cannon shook the earth, the deafening roar drowning out even the cries of men locked in deadly struggle. Waves of Ottoman soldiers surged forward like relentless tides, scaling ladders and pushing siege towers against the walls, their banners snapping violently in the wind. On the ramparts, defenders fought with a desperate fury, axes cleaving, arrows whizzing, muskets barking, each blow a prayer, each death a sacrifice to a fading legacy. Among the chaos, Emperor Constantine XI moved like a specter, rallying his soldiers, leading charges, embodying the empire's stubborn heart. His armor was bloodied, his face drawn but fierce. He fought not just for a city, but for a civilization, teetering on the edge of oblivion. Despite their valor, the defenders were overwhelmed. The great walls cracked and breached, the ancient stones crumbling under the weight of cannon fire and human resolve. As the Ottoman forces poured into the streets, the city's fate was sealed. Yet even in defeat, the spirit of Byzantium flickered, a stubborn ember refusing to die quietly. Constantine vanished amid the slaughter, his death shrouded in mystery, becoming legend, the last emperor who chose to fight to the end rather than surrender. The city that had stood as the heir of Rome for over a millennium had fallen. But its story was far from over. In the smoke and ruin, a question lingered like a ghost. What does it mean for an empire to truly be lost? The answer, like the city itself, was both tragic and eternal. The fall of Constantinople reverberated across continents, its echoes shaking the foundations of Christendom and Islam alike, marking not just the death of an empire but the birth of a new world order. News traveled like wildfire, carried by merchants, monks, and mercenaries, painting the portrait of a city that had resisted fate for 1,000 years only to be swallowed by an unstoppable tide. In Europe, the shock was profound. Kings and popes scrambled to grasp the implications, fearing the Ottoman advance might be a prelude to an assault on the West itself. Scholars lamented the loss of Byzantium's vast libraries and the refuge it had provided to ancient knowledge, while others saw in the city's fall the ominous rise of a new power that would reshape trade routes, culture, and warfare for centuries to come. Yet, amidst the mourning, stories began to emerge not just of loss, but of survival and transformation. Byzantine refugees fled westward, carrying with them precious manuscripts that would ignite the Renaissance, sowing seeds of art, science, and philosophy in the course of Italy and beyond. Mehmed II, the conqueror, proclaimed himself Kaiser Iram, Caesar of Rome, claiming the legacy of an empire he had shattered, yet also vowing to respect the city's Christian heritage, transforming Hagia Sophia into a mosque, a symbol of conquest and continuity. The city itself, now Istanbul, would grow into a sprawling metropolis, a crossroads of cultures, faiths, and empires. And though the empire that could not be saved had fallen, its spirit endured, etched in the walls, whispered in the prayers, remembered in the legends that still haunt the narrow streets and ancient stones. Constantinople's story is a testament to the fragility of power and the stubborn resilience of human hope, a mirror reflecting the eternal dance between rise and fall, creation and destruction, memory and oblivion. As we close this chapter, consider this: empires are not merely buildings and borders, they are the stories we tell about who we are, and even in their end, those stories never truly die. In the twilight of Byzantium, as the sun set on an empire that had once illuminated the ancient world, the story of Constantinople's fall is more than a tale of siege and conquest. It is a meditation on the fragile nature of power, the passage of time, and the will to endure. For over a millennium, this empire had stood as a beacon of culture, faith, and resilience, a civilization that survived barbarian invasions, religious schisms, and the relentless tides of history. Yet, no fortress, no matter how mighty, can hold back the inevitable currents of change forever. The empire that could not be saved was not merely defeated by cannon and sword, but by centuries of shifting alliances, internal strife, and the unforgiving march of time itself. Yet even in its fall, Byzantium left a legacy that transcends the rubble and bloodshed, a legacy of art, law, faith, and scholarship that ripples through history to this day. The loss of Constantinople was a crucible that reshaped the world, sparking new eras of exploration, conflict, and enlightenment. And in that enduring legacy, there is a truth both sobering and hopeful. Empires crumble, but the human spirit and the stories we forge are eternal, carried forward in memory and myth, shaping who we become. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold histories that shaped our world.